Right, hi everyone. Welcome to our final session of our Caribbean research seminars of this academic year. First and foremost, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us and for having come along to a number of our sessions over the past year. We've had a really great number of people talk to us. I'm going to ensure that I'll post the link to the videos that are all now online, should you wish to catch up with any of these. And also just a shameless plug, but if any of you would like to chair or would like to join us from September, please do email me. I'll put my email in the chat, and just contact us over the summer, and we will we'll be looking through those and kind of reaching out to people to invite people. Also, before we start, I'd like to thank Jack Webb, who should be with us, but I think I've just left him in the waiting room. Yeah. So I'd like to thank Jack Webb and Kathy Collins, Ainhoa Montoya, and Jamile Pinheiro Diaz, who've been helping us in the background organise these sessions. I'd also like to thank the Race, Roots and Resistance Collective from the University of Manchester, who have also been very supportive and in helping us organise this. Just to recap, as this is the final session of the year, I just wanted to kind of revisit our core ethos, which is that the CLAC's Caribbean Studies seminar series conceives of the Caribbean in its broadest possible sense. So we cross-cut varying historical, political, socio-cultural, linguistic, transnational and decolonial contexts. And we actively promote intellectual engagement, knowledge exchange and collaboration with across academia, but first and foremost, we welcome the participation of postgraduate students, early career researchers, writers, and more experienced scholars who wish to share their interdisciplinary, comparative, and integrated research with us. So it's with great pleasure then today that I introduce to you Anna Gerling, who recently completed her PhD at the University of Edinburgh. She's currently an early career fellow at the Institute of English Studies here at the University of London School of Advanced Study, and she will soon be a visiting research fellow at the University of Brighton's Centre for Memory, Narrative and Histories. So the research that she will present today is based on the support that she's received from an Eccles Centre Fellowship at the British Library. So Anna will talk to us today about A Companionship of Minds, Nancy Cunard and the Anglophone Caribbean Press in the 1930s and 1940s. So thank you very much, Anna, over to you.
Great, thank you, Eve, and thank you so much to you and Jack for hosting me, allowing me to share my research, and for all the patience over the scheduling. I'd also like to say thank you again to the Eccles Centre at the British Library, who made this research possible, and also to my dear friends in Jamaica, one of whom I see is here just now, without whom this work would never have begun in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to share my PowerPoint. My slide, you can see my title, Companionship of Minds, Nancy Cunard with Anglophone Caribbean Press in the 1930s and 40s. Now, before I start, I should say I'm going to be reading from a piece of paper, so I won't be looking at the camera as I'm speaking, but I am still here. On Monday, the 15th of August, 1932, an article by Nancy Cunard appeared in the Daily Gleaner under the title White and Coloured Races, accompanied by a photograph of Cunard herself. In the same edition of the generally conservative Jamaican newspaper of note, which relayed news of the Prince of Wales's fondness for dark eyes and updates from the British Empire Economic Conference in Ottawa, Cunard provided readers with her observations about race in Jamaica, following a recent 2-week visit to the island in July 1932. Taking as her starting point a comment made to her by a white Jamaican about being envied on account of his race, dismissed by Cunard as a disingenuous refusal to acknowledge the appalling treatment and living conditions experienced by most Black Jamaicans. She quickly moved on to present her reader with an impassioned, if naive account of the direct links between slavery, colonialism, and racial violence and subordination in the 1930s. Describing white superiority as a huge nail leaving its glutinous path wherever it passes, Cunard outlines the inferiority cultivated by white culture in Black men and women in an attempt to colonise their minds. She goes on to discuss the differing life chances of Black and white children, the hypocrisy of the iron hand in the velvet glove of the awakened white public conscience, and of so-called uplift and philanthropy. Implicitly questioning the British imperial rhetoric of paternalism and gradualism, she clearly states what she sees as the continuities as opposed to differences between the open brutalities of slavery and these apparently glorious post-slavery days, full of all the most unqualifiable forms of the Black man's oppression. Stating the name changes, the condition virtually remains. The article concludes with a discussion of the specifics of the Black experience as she understands it in the US and the UK, following the way that loyal Black Jamaican subjects of the Crown treated when they come to England as a breach of faith. The answer she suggests is, in very 1930s fashion, a world solution of cooperation and organisation across national and racial boundaries, and to which end she states, somewhat problematically, that Black people must learn to solidarise themselves with sympathetic white people. It was not unusual for white women to be given space to voice their opinions in papers such as The Gleaner during this period. Indeed, as I will discuss, The Gleaner and its associated publications frequently foregrounded white women in the 1920s and 30s, and often quoted at length their views on the British Empire. The difference, of course, is that these women were almost all empire builders, as one headline put it, and the opinions which they voiced were designed to uphold and celebrate the British Empire, and the solidarities which they called for, those of empire solidarity, as the wife of the Secretary of State for the Colonies put it in her message to Jamaica in 1933. How Cunard came to be published in The Gleaner in 1932, and the relation of this publication to her life and work, both before and after her 1932 trip to Jamaica, is what I'm going to discuss today. In the process, I also hope to illuminate something of the relation between white women and the Anglophone Caribbean press of this period, and of the way in which the voicing of dissent was mediated by race, class, and gender, although I'm aware that my research is still a work in progress, and as such is currently limited by a focus on a fairly small number of publications. I also hope to demonstrate the significance of Cunard's time in Jamaica in particular to her subsequent anti-colonial writing and activism, and through this to wider mid-20th century anti-colonial networks and thought. Although Cunard's 1932 article, White and Coloured Races, may strike us now as crude and naive, and even in its own way paternalistic and prejudiced, particularly in its application of a US model of race to the arguably more complex intersection of class and colorism in 1930s Jamaica. It was also one of the first pieces of journalism she published, and marks an early point in what has been called her political journey towards an active and more deeply informed anti-colonialism and theorization of white supremacy and Black liberation. Cunard would go on to write and help to produce a significant number of anti-colonial texts. These include her own large body of journalism for the Black American Associated Negro Press, her huge 1934 anthology of Black diasporic culture, Negro, and her 1942 co-authored work with the Trinidadian Pan-Africanist George Padmore, The White Man's Duty, an analysis of the colonial question in the light of the Atlantic Charter. And Cunard also spent a winter typing out Padmore's 1936 work, How Britain Rules Africa. She would go on to politically work politically with a number of the most significant Caribbean and Pan-Africanist writers and anti-colonial activists of the day, including, in addition to Padmore, Jomo Kenyatta, C.L.R. James, Kwame Nkrumah, and Nnamdi Azikiwe. Yet, despite her visit to Jamaica in July 1932 being the first time she had spent in a British colony, and although she continued to write against British rule in the Caribbean and the treatment of Black Caribbean men and women in the UK for the next 2 decades, Cunard's connection with the Caribbean has not received much attention, especially compared to the importance placed on the time she spent in the US during the same period, and her later reporting on the Spanish Civil War. This is in part, no doubt, because Cunard did not spend as much time in the Caribbean as she did in the US or Spain. And perhaps also because, just as histories of European metropoles tend to eclipse colonial histories, so the Spanish Civil War and then the Second World War have historically overshadowed international events from earlier in the 1930s. It is likely that those of you here today who have heard of Cunard know of her reputation as the ultimate socialite, flapper, bright young thing, a muse to many of the most famous writers and artists of the early 20th century. Certainly for a long time, Cunard was best remembered, if at all, for her colourful personal life, multiple sexual partners, flamboyant fashion sense, and fictionalised appearance in a range of works from and about the interwar period. Born in 1896, Nancy was the only child of Sir Bach Cunard, scion of the transatlantic shipping dynasty, and American heiress Maud Burke, who, as a self-styled Lady Emerald, became one of London's leading hostesses in the 1920s and 30s. Cunard was a rebel from an early age, and before and during the First World War, she was one of the high-profile upper-class set known as the corrupt coterie. By the mid-1920s, however, Cunard was living in Paris as an active member of surrealist circles, leaving a failed war marriage and a string of lovers behind her in Britain. Having begun to write poetry during the First World War, she brought out several collections in the 1920s before turning her hand to publishing. She set up her publishing house, the Iris Press, in Paris in 1928, and went on to issue works by Ezra Pound, Laura Riding, and Robert Graves, among many others. And she also discovered there and first published Samuel Beckett. She initially ran the press with Louis Aragon, the surrealist writer who was her partner for a number of years, and then with Black American jazz musician Henry Crowder, her partner after Aragon. Cunard and Crowder first met in Venice in 1928, and she would later claim that their ensuing 8-year relationship made her. Certainly, although she already had a long-standing interest in African culture, collecting art and jewellery from across the continent, including her iconic bracelets, and had been involved in the surrealist anti-colonial protests in France, it was through Crowder that Cunard first became alive to racial politics. Crowder had been taught by W.E.B. Du Bois at Atlanta University, and his stories of racial subordination and violence in the US and in the southern Jim Crow states in particular roused a characteristic outrage in Cunard. She would later recall the indignation, the fury, the disgust, the contempt, the longing to fight, and this was soon translated into action. She visited Harlem twice in the early 1930s in an attempt to learn more about US racial politics and to make political and literary connections. And as international outrage grew over the corrupt convictions of the 9 Black Scottsboro defendants, known at the time as the Scottsboro Boys, she became a prominent campaigner for their retrial and release, often in close collaboration with Communist Party and International Labour Defence comrades. By the middle of 1931, Cunard had given up the Iris Press to devote her time solely to political work, beginning with a compilation of what would become Negro Anthology. The anthology that would eventually be published in 1934 under the title Negro was initially called Colour and was announced via a widely circulated call for contributions, which requested outspoken criticism, comment, and comparison from the Negro on the present-day civilizations of Europe, America, South America, the West Indies, African colonies, etc. Priyamvada Gopal, in Insurgent Empire, describes the finished work of Negro as a volume of quite remarkable collective genius. And Gopal points out that it was made possible by the Black internationalist moment, in which learning about and from the lives of others was constitutive of solidarity. Meanwhile, Robin Kelly suggests that Cunard's anthology also was essential for the development of a radical Black diasporan perspective. Prior to producing the anthology, however, Cunard's writing about race in the Black diaspora was limited to 2 1931 texts denouncing her mother's racism, and using her personal experience of this to talk about race in the UK and the US, the history of slavery, present-day lynchings in the US, white liberal hypocrisy, and the role of white women in the demonization and dehumanization of Black men. Negro would go on to cover all of these topics and many, many more. It would also come with an explicitly communist internationalist framing, with Cunard's foreword declaring that it is communism alone which throws down the barriers of race, as finally as it wipes out class distinctions. Communist world order is the solution of the race problem for the Negro. Discussions of the relationship between class and race and colonialism and the economic bases and international solutions to these are, however, largely absent from Cunard's public writing about race prior to 1932, indicating that this aspect of her politics was formed or still forming in the early 1930s when she visited Jamaica. In part, this development of Cunard's political consciousness and movement leftward can be attributed to the wider political history of the 1930s. It is also indicative, I suggest, of the extent to which Cunard learned and evolved politically from the process of assembling her anthology, and more specifically from the Black men and women whom she sought out, met, corresponded, and worked with to do so. Gopal describes in Insurgent Empire what she calls reverse pedagogy or reverse tutelage, in which metropolitan dissidents came to learn something from their anti-colonial interlocutors and the movements they represented. Gopal notes the way in which Cunard, in Negro Anthology, positions herself as a student of diverse Black life and suggests that the importance of the anthology is in its unashamedly exploratory and reverse pedagogical aims. And one of the things I find most interesting about Cunard is the way in which she publicly modelled or performed the role of student, learning from others, and particularly learning through friendships and other kinds of relationships. Elsewhere, Gopal describes the importance in this period of the building of affective political communities and relationships. And my feeling is that it was this aspect of Cunard's work, methods, and personality to which figures such as Marcus Garvey, George Padmore, and others responded, in addition to her well-documented aptitude for creating transnational connections and networks. Cunard first arrived in the Caribbean in mid-July 1932. Her reputation, however, preceded her. By the early 1930s, Cunard had been an internationally known public figure for over a decade, and she and her image regularly appeared in newspapers around the world throughout the 1920s. Even she, however, was apparently unprepared for the magnitude of the tabloid furore, which erupted on both sides of the Atlantic upon the second of her two visits to Harlem in May 1932. And this shows just a selection of the US and UK press attention to Cunard, along with an extract there on the right from a Cuban magazine. There was widespread fascination in both the black and white press that this white British woman with connections to the British aristocracy, which used to stay in Harlem, and that she had relationships with Black men. She was often referred to as Lady Cunard in reports, some of which included photographs of her hotel bed. You can see that on the bottom left there. And her name was frequently linked to Paul Robeson, who was reported to be on the verge of a divorce. Cunard, and to a lesser extent the various men with whom she was linked, began to receive huge volumes of racist hate mail, a selection of which she republished in her anthology under the title The American Moron. When Cunard left the US for the Caribbean in July 1932, her secretary and travelling companion, Ansel Colebrook, and you can see him in the centre here, a Jamaican soldier who then trained as a chemist in the US, and whom Cunard had met through the Communist Party in Boston, also became the subject of front page news, complete with photographs of his supposedly abandoned wife and children. In fact, this photograph is photoshopped, and Colebrook was not married. This story was fabricated, but that did not stop it being reprinted in multiple publications, including being picked up by a number of Caribbean papers. In Jamaica, the Gleaner reported on Cunard's activities a number of times in May 1932, well before it had been announced that she intended to visit the island. Her first appearance in the Gleaner that I have found is an inconspicuous and markedly unsensational report on Cunard's stay at quote, a hotel for coloured people in New York, which also includes information about her call for contributions to a book on the coloured race. A few days later, however, as if catching up on the growing tabloid interest in Cunard, the Gleaner reported that she had been disinherited by her mother for associating with Negro artists. And these reports also made their way into a longer piece published in the Grenada newspaper, The West Indian, in July 1932, which approvingly described Sweet Nancy as an iconoclast smashing the idols of convention. Like a number of the UK and US tabloid reports of Cunard's stay in Harlem, this article tells the story of Cunard's relationship with Crowder in a breathless narrative style that would rival some of the romantic bestsellers of the time, with references to Cunard's surrender to her sole love. Unlike most other reports, however, the West Indian makes clear that it's firmly on Cunard's side, calling her a true, honest-to-goodness, dyed-in-the-wool brick of a girl, and noting that relationships between white women and black men are an inevitable result of greater racial equality, suggesting that it is just what's bound to happen if our boys get a fair break. And that article is in the bottom middle of the screen. The West Indian was founded and edited by the radical advocate of West Indian Federation, the fascinating T.A. Marichaud, who's on the right there. And Marichaud's paper, with its prominent subtitle, The West Indies Must Be West Indian, took a markedly more internationalist and progressive, even radical general stance than a paper such as The Gleaner, and as its title suggests, frequently reported in detail on events and conditions across the Caribbean. In February 1930, for instance, the West Indian carried a series of prominent reports about Caribbean experiences of the UK colour bar, describing this as an imperial problem and sympathetically noting a statement in support of Soviet Russia in which imperialism is described as the tool of exploiters. A month later, in March 1930, the West Indian featured an extraordinary editorial denouncing anti-Soviet propaganda executed in the name of Christianity, and asking what has been the Christian attitude to African atrocities, and not only atrocities of Congo origin. So Roger Casement, who exposed the Congo atrocities to the world, died on the cross, we mean the gallows. Casement had, of course, been executed for his participation in the Easter Rising against British rule in Ireland, and this question and its answer, asked by the West Indian, perhaps indicate a wariness arising from the use by various British colonial administrations of the Seditious Publications Bill, which Marichaud had personally agitated against, and which I will return to below. Certainly, it is notable that most of the fiercest direct criticism of British colonial rule in the Caribbean published in the West Indian appears in the form of reports written by, or the reported speech of, white British individuals, a presumably strategic decision based upon a knowledge of who was allowed to safely voice explicit dissent and who not. Later, in March 1930, for instance, Marichaud published a long report written exclusively for the West Indian by regular contributor, white British Labour MP Hyacinth Morgan, who had been born in Grenada. And this report extensively denounced disgraceful social conditions in Barbados, pointing out that despite the island being promoted as the head of the West Indian colonies and the shipping centre, still 1 out of every 3 children dies in its first year of life. Jamaica's Daily Gleaner, edited from 1904 until 1944 by Herbert de Lisser, like the West Indian, also featured many white contributors and voices. In contrast to Marichaud, however, and as Leah Rosenberg points out, de Lisser particularly foregrounded aristocratic English women in the publications he produced. In the front cover of the December 1930 issue of his Planters Punch, for instance, an annual magazine that was a spin-off from the Daily Gleaner, features a portrait of Viscountess Mary Willingdon under the headline, A Woman as Empire Builder. Willingdon was, as the article notes, the wife of the Governor of Bombay, the Governor of Madras, and the Governor General of Canada. And we are told she played a key part in the smooth working of her husband's various colonial administrations and in strengthening the ties that bind an outside empire to a mother country. She and her husband had visited Jamaica briefly in January 1930, during which time she had established herself apparently as one of the most charming women who have ever visited this country, a great lady and so natural in manner, so genuinely gracious in address, so bright and unaffected that she wins friendship and admiration spontaneously, exactly a woman born to accomplish much in the exalted position she occupies. The article goes on to praise Willingdon for her promotion of Caribbean products in Canada, observing the importance of status and position in such promotion. Let us not deceive ourselves. Whatever else democracy may mean, it does not mean a bringing down. In the minds of the democracy, of everyone to a common level, position will always count, especially when position is reinforced by personality. The two in combination, position and personality, are well nigh irresistible. Other issues of Planters Punch from around the same time feature similarly admiring features of women empire builders. In 1929, the Duchess of Atholl was featured with a message for Jamaican ladies. Although she would later become known as the Red Duchess because of her support, like Cunard, for the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War, she was also a Conservative MP. an opponent of female suffrage, and together with her husband, a significant investor in Jamaican sugar plantations, which Time magazine in 1928 described as vast. Her message here is, as Leah Rosenberg points out, addressed exclusively to white British women and exhorts them to do their share in upholding the British Empire. While in 1933, Lady Cunliffe Lister, the third image on the right here, wife of the newly appointed Secretary of State for the Colonies, appeared alongside her Pekingese dog with a message for Jamaica, which at that point she hadn't even visited. The main thrust of this message was, again, to celebrate what she called a strong feeling of empire solidarity and to emphasise the extent to which this was based on what she frames as mutual economic interests. A financial interest is the strongest of all interests, for where the treasure is, there will the heart be also. And while the inclusion and explicitly pro-empire stance of these British white upper-class women in these Gleaner publications is not perhaps particularly surprising given their class, race and economic interests, I've included them here briefly in order to demonstrate that although Cunard's stance regarding race, empire and class is not unproblematic, and I don't want to present it as such, it did, however, mark a significant departure for the way in which white British upper-class women were depicted and included in the mainstream Jamaican press. That is, the press owned and controlled by the Jamaican white and coloured, to use the identification at the time, ruling class. Cunard, to my knowledge, never appeared in Planters Punch, despite, like these women included, spending time in Jamaica, despite possessing the combination of aristocratic position and personality, which de Lisser claimed to find so irresistible. And it was fairly clearly her departure from this model of domestically coded femininity in service of empire, which made her a poor fit as Planters Punch cover material. She was, nevertheless, given front page treatment during her 1932 visit to Jamaica and at a number of points thereafter. And it's to this visit that I'm now going to return. Cunard's first appearance on the front page of the Gleaner was the prominent announcement of her arrival on the island, published on the 18th of July 1932. A photograph of Cunard and Colebrook was published alongside the headline, "Miss Cunard and her secretary now in the island." And the accompanying article includes an interview in which Cunard discusses the purpose of her visit and her planned anthology. Those of you who are familiar with the Caribbean press of this period will know that it was common for arrivals in their region to be announced in such a way, especially when these arrivals were prominent in their fields, or even more usually when they were members of or were associated in some way with the British aristocracy. Just a few days later, for instance, the arrival of British film star Betty Balfour was marked with reports of her cheerfulness and joie de vivre. The report of Cunard's arrival very much follows the same formula, noting Cunard's charming manner and foregrounding her links to the founder of the Cunard line and that her father was a titled Briton. The accompanying interview includes contributions from both Cunard and Colebrook and covers their experiences with the press in the US and Cuba, the existence of a colour bar in the UK, and their planned research in Jamaica, which is framed as ethnographic as opposed to reportage, perhaps an acknowledgement that a white ethnographer conducting implicitly extractive research would be more welcome to the island's ruling classes than a politically motivated journalist. Interestingly, however, the major part of this interview, supposedly with Cunard, is given over to Colebrook's analysis of the social, economic and political position of Black people in the US and internationally, though he never discusses the Caribbean, and of the impact in the US of Marcus Garvey. This is, I think, part of a widespread phenomenon of strategic obliqueness, for want of a better phrase, in which any criticism of the status quo published by the mainstream press in the late colonial Caribbean, and no doubt elsewhere, seems always to be aimed at a different target. So in Jamaica, Colebrook's discussion of economic, political and social racial inequality and his suggestion that the solution is recognition between Black and white workers of a common struggle is framed and glossed by the Gleaner as criticism of the neglect of the American Negro. Sorry, I got too far forward. This can, of course, be seen as part of the tradition of reporting on poor conditions for Black men and women in other countries, as a way of emphasising how relatively fortunate those in Jamaica in this instance were. A long article on the situation of the American Negro by the white British Labour MP Rennie Smith, published in the Gleaner on the day of Cunard and Colebrook's arrival in Jamaica, is just one example of this, with its dire depiction of the experience of many Black Americans and its depressing conclusion that there is no answer to the situation other than for the American Negro to work harder, access education, and keep a civil tongue even when he is used as a doormat. In contrast to Smith's acceptance of a logic of respectability and uplift, Colebrook and Cunard, both here and elsewhere in the Gleaner, are clear in offering a potential if abstract solution to racial and colonial subordination through their yoking of class to race in their discussions and their invocation, even if sometimes highly coded, of cross-racial class solidarity and resistance as a way out of the status quo for both Black Jamaicans and Americans. This interview with Cunard and Colebrook and the announcement of their arrival in Jamaica may seem an extension of the same press attention which had hounded them in Harlem and Havana. It was, however, also part of Cunard's attempt to control the narrative about her visit to Jamaica and to mitigate against unwanted press attention. It has been pointed out before that Cunard's often seemingly deliberate courting of publicity went hand in hand with her weaponization of it in order to promote and agitate for the causes that she cared about. In Jamaica, the opportunity to do so was a direct result of the press attention that followed her from New York to Havana, as is made clear in a letter to the Jamaican author and poet Claude McKay, written on the day after her arrival on the island. McKay and Cunard had correspondence since December 1931, when Cunard first approached McKay about asking him to contribute to her anthology. This began an active, although ultimately short-lived, epistolary friendship, which has been described by Renata Moresi as an exchange of ideas on how to build an interracial counterculture against the oppressive forces of colonialism and imperialism. McKay was also Cunard's main source of information and connections for her trip to Jamaica, and provided her with various introductions, including to his brother Theo, and to DeLisser as editor of the Gleaner. As well as thanking McKay for this help, Cunard's letter to him talks at length about her experiences with the US and Cuban press, her relief at arriving in Jamaica, and the opportunity it provided for her to give her own side of the story. She wrote, "Thanks to you, I went to the Daily Gleaner. DeLisser is in England for a month or two more. Mr. Hale, however, was extremely cordial, and we had a good talk and dinner. Since starting out from that blasted and never sufficiently hot-damned America, the usual trash has been going on in the press. It doesn't matter a damn, but it's a hell of a bore to be recognised and spoken to everywhere. So it was very pleasant arriving here on a freighter from Santiago yesterday. Not that I imagined the Jamaican press would be hysterical like the American and the Cuban. We went to the Daily Gleaner, it appears, just as they were preparing to send out further supplies of reporters, and saved them the trouble and give them all the information they wanted. When the paper is serious and will print what one has said, or even hear it, that is quite all right." The extended absence of DeLisser from Jamaica at the time of Cunard's visit, noted here, perhaps contributed to the largely favourable press that she received while she was there, and her subsequent publication in the Gleaner soon after. For although DeLisser would write in 1938 that in the Gleaner that in a country like Jamaica, we like to hear both sides of a question, it was nevertheless fairly unusual for the paper to include direct attacks on white superiority as the root of economic and social conditions endured at the time by most Black Jamaicans, such as that of Cunard's, with which I began today, or indeed those which advocated internationalist and implicitly communist solidarity as the solution to these conditions. Indeed, although DeLisser has been described variously as a deeply conservative racist and a truly avant-garde nationalist, his loyalty to Imperial Britain was nevertheless well established, as the Gleaner itself recently put it, and he was a founding member of the Jamaica Imperial Association. Over the next 2 weeks, so the second half of July 1932, Cunard and Colebrook appeared almost daily in the Gleaner. On the day after the initial announcement of their arrival, another prominent story appeared, with further extracts from the Gleaner's interview with Cunard, an announcement of a planned event with Marcus Garvey, and long quotes from stories about her in the US press, including those referring to Cunard's relationship with Crowder. This again emphasised Cunard's aristocratic connections, stating that a large turnout was expected to listen to the remarks of the daughter of a titled Briton at the Garvey event. This was also accompanied by a cartoon, which I use as the cover image for this talk, which depicts Cunard, cigarette in mouth, writing in a large book labelled Colour, while Colebrook in the background assists her by holding out a pot of ink. And the caption for this cartoon makes clear the respective roles of Cunard and Colebrook. Cunard studying and collecting local colour, while Colebrook supplies her with dope. In fact, Cunard saw her role in her anthology as an assembler rather than a writer, and she intended her visit to the island to be as much about soliciting contributions from Black Jamaicans as collecting her own material. The caption's reference to Cunard's study of the physicology of the coloured race also seems to refer to the salacious US and UK tabloid coverage of Cunard's relationship with Crowder and other Black men, even if couched in anthropological language. However, Cunard's own framing of her visit as vaguely ethnographic in nature in her interview with the Gleaner, a framing clearly picked up and used by the paper, perhaps also served her by presenting an interpretation of her visit to the island, the dynamics of her relationship with Colebrook, under the projected anthology that was easily understood and accepted by the Gleaner's staff and readership. The next day, Cunard's first written contribution to the Gleaner was published. It's her own first written contribution, a surrealish, collage-esque poem denouncing Abraham Lincoln's position on slavery. Beginning with archival extracts of Lincoln's statement that if he could save the Union without freeing any slave, he would do it, Cunard's poem ends with a mention of Lenin and the explicitly communist appeal, my love, my friend, my comrade, black on red. Cunard would include the same archival sources in a similarly critical annotated proclamation of emancipation in her Negro anthology, calling it an example of the underneath of history that comes out years later, yet that has been in the records all along for all to see, quite shameless, revelatory, convicted out of its own mouth. The poem itself would later be published by George Padmore in the Comintern paper The Negro Worker, and its somewhat curious appearance in Delis's Gleaner seems to further indicate the extent to which Cunard's identity as a white aristocratic woman whose interest in Jamaica, race and colonialism was read as personal and sexual, largely acted as a screen or a vehicle for the voicing of political dissent and opinions which would otherwise not have been printed. The reporting on Cunard and her movements over the next few weeks in the Gleaner continued to be preoccupied with her experiences in the US. Although she herself would not publish again in the Gleaner until after she had left the island, there followed a number of further accounts written by Colebrook. These initially focus on his and Cunard's experiences with the press, but also include a broader discussion of Black workers' rights, including in Cuba, which he describes as being in a very bad condition, with the workers mostly without work and terribly impoverished. Like Cunard in her interview, Colebrook also waxes lyrical about the welcome they had both received in Jamaica, including from the Gleaner, and the help given to them by Claude McKay's brother Theo of Frankfield and Clarendon, where they spent most of their time, and from Marcus Garvey. There also appeared over this period a number of advertisements for an event in honour of Cunard to be held by Garvey at Edelweiss Park in Kingston. This was the headquarters of Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association and home to his Edelweiss Amusement Company, where he would host plays, boxing matches and concerts. Cunard describes in a letter to McKay visiting Edelweiss Park on the night of her arrival in Kingston, recounting that huge crowds were there dancing, but that she, Colebrook and Garvey had sat in his office and had a long talk about the Negro and his future. In this same letter, Cunard says that she found Garvey sympathetic, admiring his energy, clarity, and noting that he is the only figure that does not pander, that dare say what he does. Garvey's welcome and send-off for Cunard, described in the advertisement as the English Traveller, was listed with the subject of Fellowship of Minds. And you can see that just at the very bottom middle of the screen there. This would be the subject of Garvey's apostrophe to Cunard, which was reprinted in full in the Gleaner. The report of this event states that 5,000 Jamaicans turned out to honour Cunard, and was accompanied by a photo of Cunard and Colebrook, alongside Garvey, Amy Jack Garvey, and various other Kingston dignitaries, a number of whom spoke at the event. Cunard and Colebrook both also spoke, but the Gleaner records that Cunard spoke only briefly, to state that she was no speaker, and to thank those in the island who had helped and welcomed her. Unlike the woman of Planters Punch, Cunard had no message for Jamaica. In contrast, Garvey's long speech was characteristically effusive and rousing. He described Cunard as the kind of exceptional character found once in 1,000 years, and like a number of the Gleaner's earlier reports, detailed the treatment she had received at the hands of the tabloid press, calling her a martyr for the stand she has taken in the cause of humanity. He concludes with a reflection on Cunard as someone who thinks sympathetically Black, using her and his own apparent shared ideals as an example of cross-racial mental comradeship or companionship of minds, suggesting that the greatest thinkers throughout history had transcended national boundaries. I cannot help but wonder if this explicitly cosmopolitan, even internationalist tribute to Cunard not only recognised her capacity for trying to think sympathetically, transcend national boundaries, and enter into mental companionship with her political fellow travellers, but also in a sense hailed this aspect of her into being, a cosmopolitan process of interpolation made possible by her time in Jamaica. Now, Cunard left Jamaica the day after the event at Edelweiss Park, although Colebrook remained on the island and would contribute periodically to the Gleaner and the Jamaica Times over the next few years, often about Cunard and her work. Cunard, meanwhile, remained a semi-regular, if remote figure in the pages of papers such as the Gleaner and the West Indian, with reports on her fundraising in London for Scotsburg, for instance, and the impending publication of her anthology. Her long article on the white and coloured races, with which I began today, was reprinted from the Gleaner in Mauritius West Indian in late August 1932, and also provoked a long letter to the Gleaner from a correspondent calling themselves proletariat on the subject of the Black race in the future. The next major appearance of Cunard in the Caribbean press was not until April 1934, and the publication of Negro Anthology, heralded in the Gleaner with an article by Colebrook comparing Cunard to Joan of Arc, and by numerous positive reviews, including here from the Jamaica Times on the right. Among its many contributions of about 800 pages, the anthology included a long essay by Cunard about Jamaica. This begins with a revisionary, at times markless history of the island, which I think has anticipatory echoes of C.R. James's The Black Jacobins, and it foregrounds Jamaica's history of resistance to slavery and then colonialism. The text, its illustrative photographs with their emphasis on the economic exploitation of Jamaican workers by British companies, and the accompanying essay by Colebrook on labour conditions in Jamaica, are perhaps partly why the British Colonial Office concluded that Cunard's anthology was a dangerous, seditious text. For the book was banned almost immediately upon its publication in a number of British Caribbean colonies, although not in the UK itself. Although Cunard was already on the radar of British security services at the time of her 1932 visit to Jamaica, attention to her had only increased over the next few years, with reports regularly filed about her meetings in London with Pan-Africanist and Caribbean political leaders and writers, and concerns were specifically expressed about her links to Jamaica and communism on the island in particular. By the time of her anthology's publication in 1934, not only had she and her work become more explicitly political, but the strikes and other protests of the 1930s Caribbean labour rebellions had also begun to stir. The Trinidadian National Unemployed Movement's Hunger March in June 1933 was one of the earliest of these demonstrations, and it is therefore perhaps not surprising that Trinidad was one of the first British colonies to announce that Negro Anthology had been banned as a seditious publication. There soon followed a number of similar announcements, including in Barbados, which were met with a mixture of amusement and resistance, including by Mauritius West Indian.
Anna, if you could start wrapping up, that would be fantastic. Maybe in the next 3 minutes.
That's perfect. That's roughly how long I have. Well, thank you. Okay. The West Indian press drew attention to the Trinidad ban in a prominent editorial denunciation, which is presumably written by Mauricio himself. Titled "Is Trinidad Disloyal?", this noted that although the work had been published in Britain, Cunard had not been indicted there and the book had not been banned. And similarly, a few weeks later, when the Barbados ban was announced, the West Indians editorial response, another attack on liberty, took aim at this inconsistency, ending with the sardonic observation that the West Indians could not be trusted to read. Freedom for the Englishman is a reality, but the British subject in the West Indies it must be an unattainable ideal. Some extracts from some of these denunciations of the censorship from the West Indian, which I'll skip through. Cunard's subsequent links to the Caribbean with Jamaica, and with Jamaica in particular, were myriad and long-standing. Although she never returned to the island, she maintained close contact with it, both through the Gleaner itself and through the many Jamaicans who she met in London. Cunard went on to write for a number of other newspapers, including through the Black American Associated Negro Press Agency. Through the AMP, she went on to report for most of the defining events and conflicts of the 1930s, including Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and the Spanish Civil War. And her reporting from Spain includes many accounts of Caribbean Republican volunteers. Cunard's later contributions to the Gleaner similarly attest to her internationalist anti-colonial sensibility, which was forged, at least in part, on the island. And she continued to try and make links between Jamaica and other international anti-colonial movements throughout the decade. In October 1935, for instance, an interview appeared in the Gleaner by Cunard with the French organizer of the Ethiopian Defence Committee, encouraging readers to become involved in defending Abyssinia and abolishing war. And this also included a statement from the Union of Negro Workers. At the beginning of the Second World War, Cunard spent a short time in Trinidad and from there wrote a number of articles for the AMP and the Gleaner about the economic and political implications of the war for the British Caribbean. She also continued to report for the AMP, particularly about the colour bar in Britain and about the achievements of Black Jamaicans especially, including Una Martin. I'm going to leave you today with these two images, however, of Cunard's articles in the Gleaner in the late 1930s. The first on the left is a January 1939 interview with Cunard by the Jamaican journalist Brent Edwards. The interview is accompanied by images of Moroccan soldiers conscript of the fight for the nationalists in Spain. And in her interview, Cunard mixes discussion of British colonialism in the Caribbean with the Spanish Civil War, stating that she had seen an anti-fascist spiritual kinship in Jamaican Republican volunteers in Spain. And this spiritual kinship, so evocative of the mental comradeship or companionship of minds used by Garvey to describe Cunard, again drives the final article on the right, a November 1939 proclamation from French Sudanese communist Pan-Africanist Garang Kouyate, stating his intention to fight for France against Germany and asking his fellow French West Africans to join him. Its appearance in the Gleaner seems intended by Cunard to inspire Jamaicans to do the same in the name of liberty, fraternity, and anti-fascism. And although a far cry from Cunard's more clear-cut anti-colonial sentiment of earlier in the decade, it's a reminder of the international and internationalist connections and conversations made possible by Cunard and her work. So I'm going to leave you there. There are obviously many directions in which this research could still go and many gaps to fill in, but I hope I've done something to interest you in Cunard's work and the place in it of the Caribbean. And I'm going to go on to my final slide, which is a list of further reading for anyone who's interested. And obviously, I'm happy to answer questions to discuss any of this further. So thank you very much, all of you, for listening. I'm going to stop sharing. You're muted, Eve.
I am muted. Thank you so much. That was an absolutely fantastic paper. Really, really enjoyed that. I'm really looking forward to people asking some questions. So you can either if you have a question, you are welcome to raise your hand, but just be aware that this session is being recorded, or you're welcome to ask a question in the chat, either using your name or anonymously. We do have a first question here, which was from Jack, who unfortunately had to slip out a bit earlier as he's traveling at the moment. And I know that you did mention this and speak about this right towards the end, but he wanted to know a little bit more about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in relation to Cunard. I know you have spoken about that, but is there anything you want to expand on in terms of the presentation and the story that you presented?
This is definitely something. There's so many aspects of this research that I feel like I could go off in different directions with, and I really want to explore further. And this is definitely one of those aspects. I think work has been done linking. I was reading something this morning. I can't remember who it was by, linking the invasion of Ethiopia to the Caribbean. But this is something that Cunard is obviously trying to do herself. She also wrote at length about the invasion of Ethiopia for the Associated Negro Press, so for lots of American Black newspapers, and she wrote dozens of articles about this. She reported from Geneva about Haile Selassie's address to the League of Nations, at which the League of Nations refused to support Abyssinia as it then was against Italy, and she was always linking this to colonialism in the Caribbean. But also to the situation of Black people in America. And I can expand on that more and more, but that's kind of what I would say just now.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have a question first off from Sally, and then we also have a question that I'll read out to you, which is from Alexandra, and it's in the chat. So Sally, if you'd like to put on your camera and ask your question, please.
Hi. Thank you. That was wonderful. You've done so much research. It was a really rich presentation. I have two questions. One, I'm curious to hear how this project came about. Was it part of your dissertation work and you're extending on that, or is this something new? Again, it seems really rich, and you brought up many new sources I hadn't seen on Cunard, so that was fun. I have a question about why Negro was banned. I had two toddlers run into my office right as you were explaining it, so I might have missed it. But you were explaining why it was banned in Trinidad. If you can expand a little on that, that was really interesting. It was mostly just that. Thanks again for a great presentation.
Thanks for your question. How it came about, my PhD thesis actually wasn't on this. I wrote on an American sort of fin de siècle writer. But I've been interested in Cunard for a long time. The short answer is I was given a novel when I was a teenager called The Green Hat by Michael Arlen, one of his trashy novels from the 1920s. But he was a former partner of Cunard's. I found him very interesting as well. But he wrote this novel after they had broken up, and it's apparently based on her. So the more I became interested in him, the more I became very interested in her. And then I have a long-standing interest in the Caribbean and Jamaica in particular. And when I realized quite a long time ago that she had spent time in the Caribbean and had written about it, I became even more excited and interested to find out more. And so I think, as I said at the beginning, my specific research into the journalism kind of started with an Eccles Centre Fellowship at the British Library, when I got to spend time there looking through some of these Caribbean newspapers, a lot of have not been digitised. And so you have to go and kind of look through the microfilm, which was a bit of a slower experience than I'd anticipated. And so I still feel like I've got a lot of work to do. I'm aware I'm kind of limited to quite a small number of publications. So that's kind of how it came about. The next question was about why Negro was banned in Trinidad in particular. I think it's because there were labor rebellions in the Caribbean in the mid to late 1930s, and these Trinidad was one of the earliest places to have significant labor unrest. I'm not sure if you were there when I said that. They had something called the unemployed workers march. I can't remember what the exact title was, which was in the summer of 1933, and that was one of the first sort of significant demonstrations or manifestations of labor unrest. And I think that until then, perhaps the colonial administrations had not been particularly worried about someone like Cunard coming to the Caribbean and kind of with her vaguely left-wing or communist rhetoric, especially because she was a woman and a posh woman, so maybe didn't take her that seriously. But Negro was explicitly communist. In her introduction, she said communism is the answer to the race problem. She's talking about James Ford, who is the Black communist nominee for the US presidential election. And so I think those two things together made it made, I think people were worried about communism in British colonies at this time. And I think that Cunard's work was seen as rightly as trying to encourage sort of Black Jamaicans or Black Trinidadians to channel their long-standing resistance and dissatisfaction in sort of into communist channels and routes.
Thank you. That really answers the question. So there was probably several books they banned in the same moment that were threatening, because there was quite a lot of stuff that would have related to that. And were there any Trinidadian contributors in Negro?
I have a copy next to me. There were Jamaican contributors. I have my copy here. I can't remember if there were specifically Trinidadian contributors. I mean, she did try and get contributions from pretty much, every sort of British ruled colony that she could. I'm looking up. Yes, there is one contribution from Trinidad by a woman called Olga Coma. I'm not sure that woman is Trinidadian. What I would say is that, I mean, this is a facsimile edition, which is still, I mean, it's still quite hard to get hold of Negro, but there is, if you go to the New York Public Library website, there is, Keziah John's putting, of course, that George Padmore is Trinidadian. Thank you, Keziah. Sorry, I think of him as just so kind of too obvious. Sorry, thank you very much. Yeah, George Padmore, her major collaborator on Padmore on Negro, was Trinidadian.
Okay, thank you for those fantastic responses. We've got a question in the chat then from Alexandra Pete, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, who says, thanks so much, Anna, for such a fascinating talk. I was especially interested by some of the international affiliations, effective and otherwise, that you traced. I wonder if you might be able to say a bit more about Cunard's correspondence with Claude McKay, and do you think he or other friends, other of her friends for that matter, helped to frame or influence her approach to and experience in Jamaica?
Yes, I think that McKay completely shaped her approach to an experience in Jamaica. The correspondence between the two of them in the lead up to her visit to Jamaica and afterwards is really very interesting. And as I think Sally said, I was trying to compress a lot of research into this presentation. And so that's one of the things I sort of didn't include too much of. But he's the one that introduced her to, or wrote her letters of introduction to the Gleaner staff, to his brother. Cunard ended up spending, I think, about 10 days with McKay's brother, Theo Mackay, who, having done various things in his life, was involved in the banana sort of farming in Clarendon in central Jamaica. And so, I think I had a slide with some photographs that she included of some workers and kind of the banana harvesting, and that's all a direct result of McKay's brother Theo and his work. So that was one way in which I think McKay sort of probably shaped her experience in Jamaica. I think Garvey, of course, was a major part of shaping her experience in Jamaica as well. She talks about meeting him on her first night in Jamaica, and he sees her off on her last night. I think that, and they obviously, they got on. But in the correspondence with McKay, Cunard is a bit critical of Garvey. She says, the one bad thing about him is he believes in God. And McKay had famously broken with the Communist Party, whereas Cunard was still affiliated, or we're not quite sure if she was a member with the Communist Party at the stage of their correspondence. And so in their correspondence, McKay and Cunard are also disagreeing about the place of communism and the relationship of anti-colonialism and communism for Jamaica and other countries at this time. And I see that someone has put a link in the chat to the digital edition at the New York Public Library of Negro. So that's a really, it's a great resource. And I should also, before we go, I will maybe go back to my final slide, which had further reading, because I actually had a link to Keziah John's talk for this series, which I learned so much from, about the radical press of the late colonial Caribbean, which was last year. And I would really recommend that everyone go and listen to that. And I'm looking forward to her future work.
I'll find a link for that and put it in the chat now so people can at least save it, because it was a really fantastic talk. And Kessa, it's great to see you online, and thanks for your contributions. Okay, we have Ruth now, Ruth Minot Egglestone, who's got a question. She says she really appreciates the new insights that she received from your presentation, and she would like to know if you could say a bit more about Jamaican volunteers within the Spanish Civil War context.
Thanks for that question. This is one of the most exciting discoveries, or things that was new to me about this research. And I think it's a real testament to my wider research on Cunard's journalism, which is about her AMP, American journalism, as well as her journalism in Jamaica. It's not just about kind of what she was saying and how she was writing it, but it's the histories that writing makes accessible and available to us. So I think that, when we think about the Spanish Civil War, certainly in Britain, there are certain sort of dominant narratives. And in America, I think more work is happening about Black volunteers in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, but we don't often hear about, for instance, Jamaican volunteers or Cuban volunteers. And in Spain, kind of Cunard is one of the few reporters who is kind of again and again searching out, and she hears that there's a Cuban woman who's volunteered, and she goes to this other town to find the volunteer and report on her. She writes a few articles about Jamaican volunteers, and I've done some research trying to find their names and find out more about them. And I've come up to a dead end so far, and it's something I definitely need to do more work on. I'm not sure if she misspelt the name or got the names mixed up. There's one case where she gives a name which is very similar to the name of a Black American volunteer. So I'm not sure if maybe he was actually Jamaican, or if she's got the names mixed up. But it's something I'm hoping to do more research on, because I think, we all want to know more about sort of Jamaican volunteers in the Spanish Civil War. So thanks for that question.
So if I may use chair's privilege, I just had a question about first of all, I think you partly answered this, but kind of where your fascination with Nancy Cunard kind of came from. What was it that you were, what kind of piqued your interest in learning more? And then your archival research, because you mentioned it's so rich. You talk about the Gleaner in Jamaica, you talk about George Padmore, so I presume that you went to the George Padmore Institute. You've obviously been doing a huge amount of work at the Eccles Centre. So where basically, how did you kind of map out where you were going to look into this topic? And was there anything, was it kind of a journey of exploration? Did it take you down some pathways that you weren't expecting? You're muted, you're on mute.
The first question, what piqued my interest? I've already talked a bit about my original kind of how I first heard about Cunard, but what really, I guess, what made me kind of more kind of slightly obsessed with her, which I think you have to be to research someone, was the work of Jane Marcus, who I haven't mentioned, I don't think yet, and she's an American critic who died a number of years ago, a feminist literary critic, and she was obviously completely fascinated by Cunard. And I wrote a number of articles about her. And one aspect of Cunard's kind of history or reputation I haven't really touched on today is that her reputation really, for a long time, she was not really known about. Even when people studied modernist literature, she wasn't really known about. And that, which is surprising considering she had links to T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound. She had links to many of the most important modernist writers, and also wrote modernist poetry herself. And so Marcus wrote a lot about why she thought Cunard had been neglected. And Marcus is a feminist literary critic and is coming at it from Cunard's I guess from a certain misogyny that Cunard experienced. Cunard didn't identify as a feminist herself at all. For her, sort of race and class, I suppose, were much more important to her. But Marcus's criticism, it's not always, she sometimes gets tiny things wrong, but she's one of the most influential critics on me. I think she shaped almost all of my writing, because she filled me with a sort of righteous anger on Cunard's behalf, which I've kind of slightly got over. But for a long time, I really, Jane Marcus's kind of mantra is write out of rage, and so for a long time I felt I was kind of reading out of rage to learn more about Cunard, to kind of overcome these kind of misogynist or patronizing interpretations of her and her life and her work. Regarding mapping up my research, I wish I had anything as nice as a map for my research. It's all been a bit sporadic, and I feel it's really very much a work in progress. Most of my work so far has been done in the British Library. So the Echo Centre is part of the British Library, but it doesn't have a kind of a building. And so I've been looking through microfilms there, and I would really recommend that for anyone who's in London or near London. They've got access, they've got a great collection of microfilm. I've done a little bit of work at the National Library of Scotland. I'm based in Edinburgh, so where I'm able to find anything kind of there. And they don't have collections of Caribbean newspapers, but occasionally they'll have something in somebody else's collection. I've been able to access some of her Spanish Civil War writings. I've been able to find that way. I'm hoping to come to London again this summer and do some more research. There are major gaps still, and I have grand plans to get things digitized, and maybe from the University of the West Indies, and sort of sent to me if I can get myself organized and get some funding to do that. There are some Trinidadian small newspapers, I'm sure Keswa is writing about, in particular kind of radical newspapers that I know Cunard had links with in Trinidad. I would love to read those and see those, but there's just that they're not held anywhere. There's no microfilms of those. So yeah, I think a lot more still to be done. I should also say that I'm going also to the Harry Ransom Centre at some point this year to do work in Cunard's own archive. And she doesn't, obviously that's not looking at the newspapers, but she's got cuttings. She kept lots of cuttings.
So am I right in understanding that this has been UK-based research? You haven't yet been to the Caribbean? Well, that's going to blow it open, hopefully, if you get to go. Great. We've got not a question but a comment from Richard Johnson, who is in Jamaica at the moment, and he said, I'm just commending you on a well-researched presentation which has piqued my interest in Cunard and will send me reading more. So all the best from Kingston. That's a really nice message. Has anybody else got any questions for Anna at this point? No? Okay, well, I just wanted to thank you for such a rich presentation. It's a really great way of kind of finishing off our academic year of seminars. So maybe just virtually just get a round of applause there for Anna, and just to say a big thank you to everybody who's been supporting us over the past 2 years. Keswa has said she has no questions, but she really enjoyed this, and thank you so much, and she looks forward to hearing more. So just on behalf of Jack as well, and myself and everybody at CLACS, just to say thanks so much, Anna, for everything. Thank you everybody for coming along, for joining the sessions, and for your fabulous questions. And do feel free to reach out to me directly, send me a direct message or an email should you wish to get more involved in the coming year, in any capacity, as a chair, as a presenter, or if you've got any suggestions about any themes or topics that you would like us to cover, please do just let us know. So thank you very much.